All right, welcome again to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the beat and pour white lightning straight onto your brain. What are we talking about today, Samo?
It is our Overthinking Wheel of Time episode. We are on part two of Rand because we went through all the darkness last time, and we've got to start there and then get to the light and what went right and how he got to where he did and what kind of brought his epiphany around.
Right. So if you need a refresher on that, that's chapter 50 in Gathering Storm is the moment, but of course it doesn't happen. Actually, let me start there before we get to we're gonna back up a little bit and start where we left off with staring into the abyss, which is Nietzsche's kind of famous quote, and Jordan Peterson on Lex Friedman a while back talked about this personally. Um, but as I was thinking about this moment and thinking about what we were going to talk about today, something popped into my head that you have brought up several times, especially recently with the election and the news, which is the meme beating the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Well, it's
there's a,
more specifically the meme beating propaganda.
yes.
Yeah.
So there is a very famous historical example of this that is actually kind of hilarious because of how it happened. Um, that popped into my head, because it's for anyone around our age. You should remember this because it was a big effing deal and it was broadcast live around the world on TV, which is when the wall came down in Berlin. And if you go read up or if you find a documentary on that and listen to people talking about how it happened, it's hilarious because it was a complete accident. Because basically, the East Germans, being Germans, were going to have a very calm and orderly, slow progression of how this reunification was ostensibly going to happen. But as word got out that they were going to open up travel to the West, that somehow spiraled out of control into rumor, and people just thought, oh, they're opening the gates. And people just started showing up at the wall and at the checkpoints. And it happened so fast that the East German authorities couldn't react. Initially, they didn't know how to react. And then they couldn't react because there were just that many people on both sides of the wall. And the next thing freaking Knight Rider is standing on top of the wall singing while people are taking pickaxes to it. It's the meme utterly destroyed a half century of propaganda. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the criticisms I had of this moment when we went through it initially was that it seemed kind of fast. And it is. But again, Jordan knows his history and is heavily influenced by history. And there's a saying that things happen slowly, then all at once, which is true. If you look back on a moment in history of, oh man, that spiraled out of control. Well, yeah, except then the further you look back, the more steps you see that got you there.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, the wall
Well,
came down suddenly all at once. Well, except you had 50 years of build up to that point.
you see this in divorce counseling or couples counseling leading right up to a divorce. That's why it's 95% ineffective,
Mm.
because by the time they get there, there's been probably a 15, 20-year buildup that started with one unresolved argument 15 years ago, and then just basically snowballing under the surface. And then they all let it out at the end. And basically, what couples counselors are at that point are just someone to be a fly on the wall to them letting it out on each other. And that's basically what happens. And again, it's slowly, then all at once. I mean, you can almost put money down that there's going to be a divorce as soon as they go to couples counseling, because it's not because the counselors are bad. It's because it was already over pretty much. So
Yeah. Well, let's start with the abyss and bring that up because Peterson has some interesting things to say about that.
all right.
It's one of the things I did learn perhaps from looking into the abyss to the degree that I have had to, or was willing to, was that at some level you have to make a fundamental statement of faith. When God creates the world, after each day, he says he saw that it was good. You think, well, is it good? It's like, well, there's a tough question. Do you want to bring a child into a world such as this, which is a fundamental question of whether or not it's good? It's an act of faith to declare that it's good because the evidence is ambivalent.
Pause that there.
And so then you think, okay, well, am I going to act as if it's good?
There we go.
So, and in the context of this clip, it's about a 8.5, 9 minute clip from the full interview he did with Friedman. And this is specifically on, I think it's Friedman poses the question that, that he thinks Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky may be the best book, best piece of literature ever. And that's kind of what snowballs this conversation. And we touched on some of that last time, talking about Nietche and Dostoevsky. And I love that thought by Peterson of unpacking this idea, as he puts it, an article of faith that it is good, and is it? The evidence is ambivalent. That's a heck of a way to put it. Which, and again, this is someone who spent a very long time as a clinician, so and dealing with some hard cases, which means you are repeatedly opening yourself up to different kinds of trauma in order to help someone get over their trauma. Well, that's going to have an effect on you.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are with Rand. Now, this is why we tell these stories, because you're cranking it up to 11, because now he has, Peterson uses the example of people who get kind of, especially younger people today, get caught in this existential nihilism and, well, I'm not ever having kids because it would be cruel to bring a child into this world. Well, Rand is dealing with all the potential children now and for the next age. That's the weight on his shoulders. And
including in this conversation he's having in his own head at the end there, his future self.
So yeah, you add on to that the metaphysics of this world, which is, it is a given, it is an ironclad belief of reincarnation of the soul in the wheel of time. And he's freaking tired of that. He's tired. I mean, that is what you get from the end of chapter 49 and into the beginning of chapter 50, is he's just tired.
Well, I think this is a good spot to put in, because I was listening to some stuff on Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky's my homework for the summer, so I haven't. This is one of the few I haven't read yet. But I was just doing some, and they were talking about the protagonist in Crime and Punishment, and one of the important things that struck me in my head when the person was talking about it was that the protagonist did bad things, but he had every reason.
Yes.
He had a lot of reasons, and that's what makes these characters so complicated, which is why I'm looking forward to reading it. But when we go to Rand, we started this whole line of thought with analyzing the Forsaken when we did Grendel and then Ishi. And one of the things about the Forsaken was our new follower Finn's talked about the grab for power and the power hungriness, the hunger for power and everything. The delta between Rand and the Forsaken, even when they all do evil things, is that Rand has every reason to hate. Rand has every reason to be pissed off. Rand has every reason to want to kill. Because look at the freaking trauma that happened since that rider showed up in the prologue of Wheel of Time, or Eye of the World. So he's been put through the ringer. He's been tortured. He's got wounds that won't heal. He's psychologically damaged, both metaphysically and what would hurt a real life person. And that caused him to do a lot of bad things. But the Forsaken, they did a lot of bad things to grip power, to get their their base needs, their hedonistic needs taken care of, whether that's their narcissism, whether that's like Asmodean, whether that's revenge like Lanfear, whether that's complete nihilism like we talked about with Ishi. Uh, so that's the difference. Is he has every reason to be, but he's still trying to look at the world and say it is good. When his recent history of life is everything but good. It's not our kids these days that are just watching the news and saying, "Oh, I don't want to bring a kid into this world."
Yeah.
It is, I went through it.
Uh, so right near the beginning of the chapter, as he's sitting and staring at the access key, thinking, he had been here for hours, and yet he did not feel tired. He stared at the ter'angreal, thinking, what was he? What was the dragon reborn? A symbol, a sacrifice, a sword meant to destroy, a sheltering hand meant to protect, a puppet playing a part over and over again. He was angry, angry at the world, angry at the pattern, angry at the creator for leaving humans to fight against the Dark One with no direction. What right did any of them have to demand Rand's life of him? Well, Rand had offered that life to them. It had taken him a great while to accept his death, but he had made his peace. Wasn't that enough? And then down he goes, thinking about where did it all go wrong, and he thinks about everything. Um, he had thought that if he made himself hard enough, it would take away the pain. If he couldn't feel, then he couldn't hurt. And here he's clearly talking psychologically and physically. And then he goes into it. The wounds in his side pulsed in agony. For a time, he'd been able to forget them, but the deaths he had caused rubbed his soul raw. That list started with Moraine. That's why we talked about regret. That's why I said it was a segue into what we're going to talk about here. Is he is abusing himself with regret, and it has become a very deep negative loop. That his That's why I started off with Peterson talking about staring into the abyss. Well, he's been staring into the abyss a good long while, and he has become quite proto Nietzsche in the first half, as we've talked about. Um, Everything had begun to go wrong at her death. Before that, he'd still had hope. And this sentence really jumped out at me, not just because it is a sentence, it is a one sentence paragraph by itself, but because I don't know if we talked around it, and I don't know if we connected the dots specifically. And that is, before that, he'd never been put in a box. Rand talks a lot, and Jordan talks a lot in um A Crown of Swords, especially, and then it comes back up again in Winter's Heart with Min talking to Cadsuane about what they did to him physically. Um,
I think we've used this one before, but we might have to use it again because I want to add to your point on
uh
the regret and starting with Moraine. No, his past self is also in the same spiral. He's in
yeah,
the same loop because
and
for those that are just listening, it's a meme with the pawn shop guys, and it says, Rand, it would be super useful if you could give me some advice on how to fight this Forsaken right now. And then Luce there and is the pawn shop guys, and it says, best I can do is weeps and distance. And realistically, that's the nature of the whole relationship. Is Rand doesn't start getting nihilistic until Luce Theron comes into the picture and basically pours his depression into Rand's head. That might be the madness itself.
yeah,
Is that depression from the bad thing he did, which was the last moment of his life, and
that's a
he
good
could
point.
never atone from, which is where we get later in Rand's
And
progression here.
and until we get past this moment when he, reintegrates his cells, it is just the negativity. And we'll see when he finally starts talking later and more when we actually get points of view from him in A Memory of Light, is as I talked about the difficulty, and but I think the key in overcoming regret is the distinction between being self-critiquing and self-critical. Is that afterwards he is no longer self-loathing, self-critical. He can honestly self-critique without letting that drag him down. Critique and learn and move on, and you actually see it in those moments, that even though he's not perfect, he is building, he is improving because he is able to do that. And I hadn't considered the yes, the voice is going to be an antagonistic thing, because oh my gosh, there's this voice in my head, and my whole childhood, this guy has been a boogeyman, Luce Theron, Kinslayer, and now he's in my head, and he's only feeding me the negativity.
Mm-hmm.
Even when he's like helpful in the technical or tactical sense, it is to feed that negativity. It is why is he helping Rand talking through how you break a shield? Because he wants vengeance. He wants to get back at the ones who have been abusing him. And then when he's helps him with weaves later to kill, like in Knife of Dreams, it's rage. It's just he's just unleashing his rage. Mm-hmm. It's not to help him defeat the shadow, to help him be the hero of the light. It's just fueling the negative emotions. And I think the box is a big part of that, because I hadn't really considered this, put on my pop psychology hat here for a second, but the box was both a cause and an effect, because Rand was already starting to feel the beginnings of being in a allegorical box way back at the beginning of The Dragon Reborn. That's one of the reasons he runs off on his own. That's that's the key reason remember when Perrin comes back into the camp with the Shinarans and asks Min what's going on, what are they arguing about? It's about what they've always argued about, which is her controlling him, her keeping him in this box of this canyon when he wants to get out and do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's actually one of the major plots of the whole story when it comes to Rand is everyone trying to control him and instead of guide him. That was Moiraine's epiphany, right? She needed to guide him and stop trying to control him. And that's when she was it book 5, Fires of Heaven, when she made that. Yeah. So, and it actually, even for her, who's considered one of the wisest people, if we use the word wisdom here, mm-hmm. in the book series, it took her seeing the future to finally have that epiphany. And
seeing the future, and speaking of trauma, seeing her own death
many times.
Yeah, and knowing that sometime sooner rather than later, she's going to die.
Even more importantly for her, it wasn't even seeing her death; it was seeing her failure. Mm-hmm. She was already okay with dying since New Spring, which on a chronological timeline is 20 years prior to this.
But the certainty that it's sooner rather than later put a clock on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, speaking of Peterson, this is something that I had forgotten about. It's in one of the early chapters of 12 Rules for Life. Is one of the techniques he gives is, hey, especially to youngsters, if you find you have trouble concentrating, then put a clock on yourself. Like if you're studying, if you're doing homework, put a literal clock on yourself, and it will make you focus. Say, I've only got 30 minutes to do this. I need to focus.
Parkinson's law, the task will expand to the time you have to do it.
And so if there's no time limit, well, you're just going to sit there at the table with your brain wandering off forever.
Which is why this research paper I have to do will probably end up going to the midnight hour on Monday.
Well, they so often do. Before we get back to the text, and then before we get to more Jordan Peterson, I brought up the pop psychology, and so let's do a little more of that with. I mean, I think I first learned this term, this idea. I want to say it was 7th or 8th grade health class is when but it may have been before that. But that seems basically in middle school health is when I can remember learning about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so here is the basic pyramid from the Wikipedia entry. And I took this one because it's basic. It's Wikipedia. It's what people are going to find when they do a search of this. It's what's probably going to pop up first, but also because in looking at various images, I saw a bunch where people had added a bunch to these layers, these levels, and I wanted to go with the more basic one, but then also get the actual psychology of this and if this has grown or advanced since our years in middle school. Um, so, and the other reason I wanted to bring this up is because I've used the term self-actualization a number of times for what happens here on Dragon Mount with Rand. And um, when I was looking for clips and when I was thinking about getting ready for today, one of the things that popped up while I was looking for through YouTube is a guy I've mentioned before, Master Samwise is the channel, and he has a new video on how to write and not write self-actualization.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses a number of examples from movies, and one of them is comparing and contrasting the original animated Mulan with the live action one, which I can actually speak to because it's been on in the background and I saw enough of it to go, this is awful. Why are these the lessons we're teaching children these days? Basically the difference is in the animated, Mulan actually has to work for it to become a warrior and an inspiration to the other warriors she's with. And in the live action version, she just has to realize that she was great all along and she just has to believe in herself. Well, that's not actually how you climb the steps of this. That is going to give you a faux self-actualization, which we kind of started off earlier talking about the Forsaken and where they are on this pyramid and what they care about, what they focus on, versus Rand and how he was able to escape the clutches of the darkness that he had come to embrace. And so the bottom of the pyramid, the most basic needs are your physiological needs: food, water, warmth, and rest. Then after that, you can focus on the second set of what here are called basic needs, which is safety, which is just physical security and safety.
Yeah,
Then
and for someone that would say, well, why isn't that first? Well, go enough time without food or water
yeah,
and see what kind of risks you take to get the food and the water.
mhm.
So,
Yeah, exactly. And then we start to get into the psychological needs. And the the point Master Samwise makes in his video that I think is really important is, and it touches on what we talked about last time with psychopathy and seeing people as things, is once you have your own personal basic needs fulfilled, then you can start being the social creature that humans are. And how you interact with the people and the world around you is going to have a big influence on how successful you are at meeting these needs for yourself, but then also helping others climb this pyramid as well. And so the first stage is belongingness and love needs, intimate relationships and friends.
yeah, I would add family to that as well. But,
Yes.
yeah.
Then you get to esteem. That's prestige. That's feeling of accomplishments. Well, Rand is clearly accomplished. He clearly has prestige. He has clearly climbed this, but how did he achieve that prestige and those feelings of, and what did those feelings of accomplishment become? You know, contrast who he was when he pulled the sword from the stone and was acknowledged, oh yeah, this really is the Dragon Reborn, versus the end of A Crown of Swords when he gets the crown. And isn't it, is Dashiva the one who says, "Hail Rand, King of the World," or something like that?
Oh,
And
I don't
it's
remember.
it's either him or Taim, and that's not an accident that it's one of them who swells up Rand's head with King of the World, um, versus the the true feeling of accomplishment that he gets from winning the Aiel to his side. And I think that's why he views them differently, why he has a different relationship with them, and why it takes someone later like Darlin, who was a rebel against him, but he was able to win him to his side.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that helps him actually top the pyramid is there were enough steps along the way to hold him in the light enough that he didn't go fully into the darkness
I wonder
like
if
the
that
Forsaken
affected
do.
his relationships too, because if you look at what happened at the beginning of book 4 with Elaine, where basically he kind of stops doing the "I'm going to marry Egwene one day" and
Uh-huh.
switches to Elaine, he won Elaine over. But
Mm.
what was happening in the village? They were just gonna be married.
It was
Everybody was
just
like, "Oh,
assumed,
yeah,
yeah.
the cutest girl in town and the tallest guy in town, they're gonna be the ones that get married." And
They
everybody
were
just kind of like pushed it in that direction.
they were basically match made
Mm.
between Myron uh
Oh, there.
Alver
Yeah.
and Tam Althor, is they more or less match made these kids
Hmm.
from a pretty early age. That's a good point. Um, so he was never able to achieving one's full potential is how this defines self-actualization, including creative activities, is he didn't fully realize his potential in that area of relationships until he had to win men over. Even though you get from her point of view, even though she knew it was fated, he still had to win her over, which is why I think she's one such a compelling character. And then Avienda, obviously, he had to win over, um, by getting naked with her in the snow, giggity. Um, and then I think that's a good point about how he won over Elaine without realizing what he was doing, and I think that's why it worked. And that put a pin in that because we're gonna um kind of draw a real world lesson from the moral tale of Rand talking about relationships with another Peterson clip. Do you have
Now,
anything to
yeah.
add to the pyramid here
Well,
before
this
I
is
take it
you.
down?
You wanted the modern view of it. A lot of the good psychs are going kind of back to this,
Mhm.
maybe slightly modified. Uh, and the bad ones are really focusing on that self-actualization part. But so one of the reasons a lot of good psychs, because ev psych is getting bigger, evolutionary psych is getting bigger, despite the pushback against it,
Mhm.
because nobody wants to hear those things, uh, is that self-actualization, the top part. I mean, that's like what I was talking about with dwelling on regret. It's a first world problem, realistically. You look at the history of history, advancement in the arts, especially, those were the aristocrats. Those were the
Mhm.
people that had the monies and had all this, basically had all the stuff below it uh, taken care of. You rarely had everybody makes fun of the starving artist. The starving artist is kind of a modern trope
Yeah.
because the I mean, Da Vinci had like funding out the wazoo. Apparently, he was a super
Y-
charismatic dude and was showing up to all the
Yep.
parties,
You
and
either
people would
had
just
to be wealthy or you had to have a wealthy patron.
yeah, and he would just throw ideas out there, and people would be like, "Take my money," and that's apparently why he's the household name. Now, he
Mhm.
was also a genius to go along with it, so that's great. But he was also just great. He somewhat because of substance. I hate to use this word, but somewhat of a charlatan, you know. And he would get. I mean, the dude was pretty probably from. If he was a grant writer, he would be at Stanford or one of the best universities in the world because he could get the monies. Okay, so now where a lot of F-Psych is coming in, though, that's modifying this a little bit, is that belongingness and love needs. What the social roles psychs have right is belongingness is way more important than we gave it shift in the past
Mhm.
because the two bottom ones, actually, with a social animal like us, are very dependent on the two above it. If you have esteem in your tribe,
Mhm.
and you have family and friends, you are more likely to get the other things, the
I
food,
was
water,
just
warmth, security, safety.
thinking that with what I know and what I have heard people like Peterson talking about, I wonder personally, I would think you would need to flip those two because if you don't, and this is something I touched on talking about regret, is one of the problems I think with it, and why it is such a first world problem, is because for way too long, even though we taught this in school, we also basically taught people you could skip that third and that fourth step. You could just go straight to self-actualization because gosh darn it, you're special and people like you. No, no, no. There's a reason this is a pyramid.
Now,
You
I
have
will
to.
say the pyramid is still right though, because say you
Hmm,
and I are in the desert, starving and thirsty, and there's a little puddle of water with a little bit of something that's edible there, and we have no idea and we haven't eaten for days. At some point, we're probably going to fight over that. Whereas if it was all equal, we would go ahead and share it, thinking we would do better together. But yeah. So I would still say it's right. It's just probably not so much of a pyramid as kind of a foundation on the bottom and then this pretty house on top is self-actualization.
hmm.
So that you can't have the top one without having all of the other ones met. So that's where it's right.
Yeah.
And it just might not be, it might be a steeper pyramid where the others are just bigger to put in there. Other than that, people are going back to it because it's like, oh yeah, this actually was pretty genius when it was made.
A point Peterson makes in that interview with Williamson that we're gonna bring up later, but I don't think he makes it in the point where we're gonna play is I'd heard him say this before, but I'd forgotten it. And when I was re-listening to that last week, it really hit me. I went, oh yeah, that is important. Is so because what they're going to talk about is essentially um critiquing the manosphere, the the Andrew Tate wing of the men's movement, and why it's so problematic. And so one of the problems with that bubble is that they they make women out to be the villains rather than this women are people and this is who they are and this is how they think, generally speaking. And one of the um things that really sticks in the craw of guys in this sphere is, well, women only want money. No, as Peterson points out, the reason women are attracted to high incomes is because income is an insert for competence. And this is one of the reasons why I am becoming more and more an advocate of serious relationships at a younger age, the
Well,
way we used to do it.
let's go to the animal kingdom. Okay, so peacock's feathers. This is one of the things that I mean, all birds, the males are the flashy, colorful ones in bird species. And the big question was, why do the peacocks have their big feathers? Why are the female peacocks attracted to the ones with the big feathers? Because it's a sign, it's a signal. It says, look at this thing that makes me slower and harder to get away from predatory animals, and I'm still alive.
Hmm.
And so, what people don't know about genetics and development in the animal kingdom, and includes humans, is things that are very colorful are actually costly when it comes from a resource standpoint.
Yeah.
The bird that is super colorful is a well-fed bird. Okay, it's the vibrant displays are actually very costly. That is a bird.
If you want an example of that, go find a before and after picture of Ariana Grande when she went vegan.
Oh God. So a bird that is super colorful and vibrant is also a bird that's very good at gathering food. And
Yeah.
so when the birds mate and they have their eggs and the little baby birds need food, everybody talks about the mother coming and regurgitating the food. Mother and father do that. And in fact, when mother is vulnerable during the last days of having to be able to poop these things out of herself, father does almost all of it, right? So birds do pair bond because it's a team effort.
Hmm.
And vibrant bird is bird good at doing his job. Same thing with guy with expensive car. He is good at making money. He is good at providing
Or,
resources. He is competent.
or
Unless
when
he
you're
comes
younger.
where we've muddied the water, and this is where kind of the Tates are a little bit right, although he's a beneficiary of this, is we have generational wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So you could be a trust fund baby and look the same as someone who worked their way to the
Mhm.
top. So that's
Yep.
where it got muddy, and that's where the dysfunction is coming in. But again, first world problems.
It's one of the reasons we spent so much time ranting about that. The simple little, it would have taken you 30 seconds to have Lan teaching the boys how to fight. Why? Because the
You would have
reason
known
I
they
brought up
couldn't do it.
yeah,
And
the reason I brought up the pyramid is because Rand is able to self-actualize despite all the pitfalls, all the problems, all the things trying to pull him back into the abyss, because that esteem, that belongingness is earned. He put in the work. He put in the work with his close group of friends. He
well,
put in the
he's
work.
good at reflectiveness because he killed Turok.
Mm,
And he can look back at that, even though many books later, I think he even reflects on it. And he's like, I got lucky.
mm,
But you look at when he's training, when he's trying to get the best swordsman to fight him and all of these things, he's going for that competence.
yeah.
So he's actually, this is where he's got a solid head on his shoulders. He didn't say, I'm a swordsmaster, I killed Turok, and then just go from there and then talk about the day when he, remember when I scored 4 touchdowns for the Polkai Panthers, right? So he continues to become work on being competent, which is what it takes. It takes hard work. And I think, yeah, I'm going to let you go where you're going with that, but that's kind of a contrast I wanted to throw in there because it was relevant.
Well, let me go back to the book for a second, because as I was looking at chapter 50, I happened to glance over at the last page of chapter 49, and I said, "Wait, did I notice this before?" So speaking of slowly and then all at once, what is potentially the last bit of setup before Hasselhoff is singing on top of the wall here in chapter 50 is he uh gates to Dragonmount and hear the world spread out before him. Why have we come here? Rand thought. Because Rand replied, because we made this. This is where we died. He's already started the process. This is that is the end of his long struggle to this moment. And I think that those two sentences right there, the fact that Rand thought and Rand replied to himself, that second voice is gone. He's already started the process of self-actualization.
Well, except it's funny because the second voice is labeled as a second voice in the next chapter.
But it's Rand.
Hmm.
It is Rand on some level, I think, realizing Luce Theron isn't a villain. He's not a monster. He's not some crazy voice. He's me. And part of the self-actualization is the self-critiquing without being self-loathing. It's acknowledging on some conscious or seemingly subconscious level, that's me. And I've got to figure this out.
Hmm.
Because the weight of the world is on my shoulders and I've got to figure this out. And he does get to a moment in this back and forth in his head where he does think, I literally have the power here to do what I did on Dragonmount times 1,000. And so I can crack the world like an egg and just stop it all right here. So it's not that he has won, it is he has started the process at least with that acknowledgement that that's me. The voice was me all along.
Hmm.
Um, so I lost my train of thought.
Well,
Uh,
I don't know if this is going to completely derail, so use this as time to get your thought back. But this is where I think the creator did step in partly,
hmm.
and
Oh, that's right,
because
right.
yeah, because what we do see is the light that's blocking the darkness that is the taint in his head.
Hmm.
And uh I teased this last time that the creator refused to step in and do the job, right? But I think at this point in Rand's realization, there was also a realization from the higher power that because the Dark One actually has physically touched the world, I have to do at least enough to balance that out. Because the Dark One's touch on the world is the taint. The Dark One can't get out yet. All he has is his minions doing his bidding. But the taint is actually his touch on the world. And all the creator did was basically block that out from Rand. So Rand can do his thing as a human without the Dark One's touch on him.
To that point, I had you'd brought that up, you teased it before, and we've talked about it off air before. And so to that point, then going to the end, to the last page of this chapter, is I think evidence for that perhaps the creator stepped in here just a smidge to um to put the light around those barbs of the taint that Nynaeve sees later. Is he is shouting in his head, why do we have to keep doing this? Why did the creator do this? um let's see. And he's on the verge of cracking the world like an egg. Rand raised his arms high, a conduit of power and energy, an incarnation of death and destruction. He would end it all, and let men rest finally from their suffering. Stop them from having.
Which is funny because that's exactly what Ishii was trying to push him to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Stop them from having to live over and over again. Why? Why had the creator done this to them? Why? And the voice was suddenly gone there at the end of the last chapter, but now it's back. But note the difference. Why do we live again? Lews Therin asked suddenly. His voice was crisp and distinct. So Lews Therin, the Lews Therin side of Rand, is the one who helps him come to this self-actualization, come to this realization that, it's not all darkness. I'm not just going to lay down in the ditch and die, as we talked about last time. But the Lews Therin side of him is able to do that because he's no longer a ranting, weeping madman.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there is something to that idea that, the creator sneakily steps in here to help guide things just a smidge.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, it's not coming in and fighting the battle. It's just leveling the playing field and letting Rand as a human fight the battle for humans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did like that Lews Therin's answer was that we can do it again. We can make it right, was kind of the thing. We can do better this time. And that was great.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if this was Sanderson or Jordan, but then they were like, "Oh, so we can love again." And gosh, it's such a tired trope.
It is a tired
was.
trope.
Yeah.
But it's a trope for a reason. Of there's a song, a couple of songs actually, of by one of my favorite retro synthwave, which is like just 80 synth but modern. Mostly on their internet is where you find them, because you don't really find them on the radio. Anyway, there's a group called Gunship. It's a really cool group for electronic music, and they have a song called Tech Noir, which for you nerds out there, is the club that Linda Hamilton goes in to try and escape the Terminator in T1. Anyway, but they have an opening narration because it's kind of a story song. It's kind of a concept album. They have an opening narration by John Carpenter about how it's basically this post-apocalyptic nightmare, and we brought it on ourselves and we deserve it. Well, in Tech Noir 2, there's this new recording intro by John Carpenter who says, it's not all worthless anymore. And he's no longer just leaving a note because this is the last thing I'll ever say, this is my epitaph. He addresses it to my son. And that's important, that birth is the answer to our mortality, because we are passing this on. And so I think that part could have been said better, but what's happening there is Luz Theron, the father and grandfather, no longer in the clutches of the madness of the taint, saying, yeah, son, you still got a lot of life left to live.
Mm-hmm.
So do all these other people. And so did the generations yet unborn. That's why we do this. And so that moment of clarity from someone who intellectually knew this, but was in the thralls of madness and despair such that he ended his own life at the end. And that was the Luz Theron that was always ranting at Rand. And now the lucid Luz Theron is able to say, yeah, that sucked. We screwed it up, but now we can get it right. And that matters because.
Well, this goes back to the survivors from the I think it's Golden Gate Bridge, jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, and they interviewed the survivors and say they all regretted it, of course. And they said, "Well, what was your moment of regret?" And they said, "The moment I let go." And Luz Theron never he let go and died. And now we get a lucid Luz Theron who regretted letting go. And he's basically like, no, don't do the thing I did. Let me tell you about this. Whereas before, he never was out of that loop. He was always the letting go. We need to die. Oh, my Ilyana. Oh, weeping in shadows. He was still in that moment of death, which he never had that point of regret because he didn't survive it. And so now we have a situation where he's kind of alive again in somebody else's head, in his own head, but in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, wrap your head around that one. All right. Well, I wanted to.
Well, I think this is where the blending comes together too, because of what I said before about part of the taint. I think it's no surprise that the people who are struck with the taint are hearing voices probably of their past selves, because the Dark One is also the Lord of the Grave. And so that might have been a side effect, right? Because look at what was the one that was making basically childhood blocks out of the building.
Yeah.
The madness wasn't the voice. The madness was him basically just turning into a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
But having the power to do it with giant pieces of stone from the building around him. But he also heard voices. The voice isn't the madness. The madness is just accompanied by the voice. And it probably escalates it because you have a voice in your head.
Yeah. Speaking of negative voices in your head, this is where I wanted to segue about the applicability of these ideas to real life, because this negativity bias is really prevalent in young people today, and this is why there's a manosphere, because they're desperately seeking something. But going back to last time and Peterson talking about Nietche, which we opened with here because that was kind of the segue of, well, if you stay over here and you don't progress, as we talked about, if you don't read the next slide, you're like, yeah, Nietzsche's right. This is all pointless and worthless. And, everything sucks and everyone sucks. And well, is that going to help you climb that pyramid? No, the exact opposite, actually. And so we have an exchange here between Chris Williamson and Jordan Peterson on this is something I had never heard before. And I had to listen to it a second time to hear them unpack this more about where the incel movement and community, if you will, came from. And then Williamson kind of unpacks the internet history of that. And then Peterson talks about what I referenced last time of how acting in a psychopathic way will turn you into a psychopath.
Yeah, and if anybody is curious about incel communities and the actual good research on it. William Costello out of University of Texas. University of Texas just does a lot with relationship work anyways, because it's Dr. David Buss's department, and he was the Evolution of Desire author. So William Costello, Alexander, I don't know his last name. He goes by Date Psych on Twitter. Caitlin, his future going to be future wife, I think. I think they're engaged now. They're all doing like a lot of good work on incels, and they've also been guests on Williamson as well, or at least Alexander and Costello have been. All right, so share.
The beginning of the incel movement and the black pill movement was born out of pickup artistry. The origin, if you trace it back using internet history, of the incel black pill ideology was I think it's a subreddit or a website called PUA Hate, Pickup Artist Hate. And what it was a group of men who had been through the pipeline of pickup artistry and come out the other side with a very jaded and even more jaded view of the world.
Even more jaded.
Yes, and I'll tell you why. So what happens if a guy learns old school mid-20 noughts pickup artistry is you realize that there is a particular set of actions, a script that you can run, which makes it more likely that a woman is going to go to bed with you.
Right.
Pause a second.
But what you realize when you...
Well, I was going to pause it anyways because I've watched it happen. I know exactly when some of my friends are about to close the deal because I'm like, oh, here comes this. Here comes this. Oh, they're doing this.
And this is applicable in a number of different ways because anyone who has ever worked a sales job has had to learn this stuff because there are certain things you do that basically create check boxes in people's minds. And it works enough times that that's why you have a script if you are a salesperson, because you're keying in on these parts of the brain that goes, oh, hey, yeah. Oh, hey, yeah. Oh, hey, yeah. And you're trying to essentially short circuit the deeper thinking parts of the brain is what you're trying to do, because you don't want objections to what you're trying to sell, whether that is selling an actual item or selling yourself to a potential relationship partner.
Well, and just having a script, period, makes you look more competent because there's less ums and pauses and let me think of the words I need to have in my head. If you ask me a question that I might know about, but it's complex, I might pause for like 20 seconds or 30 seconds to let me formulate my answer in my head. But if I've got a script that comes back to every question, then it's going to come right out and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, this guy knows so much. He's so smart. And same thing with trying to attract a female. You're basically, you know what you're going to say every time. So they almost can't say anything that you don't look like you have the answer for. And they're like, man, this guy's sharp.
So before we get to the downside of that, of how that goes wrong, besides the surface level problems with it, this is one of the reasons I like people like Williamson and Peterson. Not because they validate me, not because, I just brain farted on the fallacy, the validation bias of only, cherry picking your data. There's a term for it. To validate what you already think. It's illustrated by how often they have dead air, which you shouldn't be doing if you're a radio/podcast guy. That's dead air is killer. You're supposed to have content. You're supposed to be entertaining. And yet both of these guys, Peterson especially, will go, well, and they will pause and they will think, and they don't care that there is suddenly this silence in what is supposed to be a conversation or a lecture. No, let me think through what I was about to say. And is this true? And is this the best way to say it? And then they will speak.
So this is something Williamson had to learn. So we talk about competence and learning and trying to get better. You can see on the bottom left of the screen there, he's got 3.37 million subscribers. I remember from his 100K subscriber episodes, things I learned. When he would hit a milestone, he would do an episode that was just kind of a monologue of things I learned coming to this point. 100K subscribers was I've been listening to him since before he hit that, and you can just you just heard him talk. You can tell that if you're going to be a podcaster or an educational YouTuber or whatever, you can learn a lot from this guy because he's got good pacing and his voice is clear. I think he actually goes to a voice coach to help with that. But one of the things he said he learned talking to Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's probably one of the smartest guys in the entire world, Conciliation Project, I think is his organization. And he said, I learned from that interview to be okay with silence because I would always jump in when there was silence. But you could tell just looking at him, and it made me pause that, yeah, he's going to take about 20 or 30 seconds to formulate his answer to what I just asked him, but it's going to be the best answer you've ever had. So I better not interrupt that process. And that's true because Schmachtenberger will kind of sit there after the interviewer asks him a question and kind of look around for a second. You could see in his head the clock, the gears going. And so he gave a lot of cues to not interrupt my train of thought. And then he would come out with a very concise, brilliant answer on the other end of it. Where I think that was a great epiphany because sometimes if you try to answer too quick, we do it all the time. It's probably our biggest problem.
Yeah.
We'll answer too quick and we'll start meandering around the answer because we're trying to think about it while we're talking.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he had to learn that many years ago when he was 1/30th the size of his pod, and that's probably why he blew up the way he did. Of course, This is one of those things it's Diary of a CEO talks about this too. Steven, I can't remember his last name, but he said it's another one of those very slow and then all at once things. He's like, it was like 400 videos before anybody was watching me, and now I have millions. And it happened like the curve was like that. So yeah, what you want to keep going now?
Yeah, keep going a little bit.
You do that as you learn how to nag and do kino escalation and tell them that story about the midget fight outside or whatever your script is that you're running. You then begin to see just how far away that person is from the person that you actually show up as.
Right.
Who you are and this extravagant persona that you need to convolute into existence in order to get this woman into bed makes you feel
worse even. Yeah.
Feel the gap between where you are
Positive,
and what you have to do in order to achieve the thing.
That's why that's why the line was so big in the next book after this one. I exist.
Yeah.
He just is. I am me.
To that point, so when we were talking about Rand's sickness, one of the theories that we went down, one of the threads we went down was someone postulating that the further away he got from his true nature, the more he tried to make himself hard instead of strong, the worse the sickness got. And as evidenced by that, back to the beginning of chapter 50, just a few paragraphs down, he still held to the source. He didn't dare let go. This last time he'd seized it, it had been the worst he could remember, and he feared that the sickness would overpower him if he tried again. So here we are, right before he achieves this self-actualization, right before his darkest moment where he's seriously contemplating cracking the world like an egg and just ending it all for everyone. And that is the moment the sickness is the most powerful, because that is the point he is the farthest away from who he truly is, who he was raised to be, who he thought himself to be before all of this started, who he tried to be for a long time in the early days of being the dragon. And then the more his head got swelled, the more he had to compromise on his values as he saw it to get things done, the more he rationalized the greater good while still flagellating himself over the human suffering, the more he became ill until we reached this point here.
Mm-hmm. Which is part of his connection to the nature too, right? The prophecies say that he is one with the land and all of these things, and the land is obviously getting more sick as we go. And we know this from human psychology. Let me bring up an example: the cancer rate survival, cancer survival rate. They've actually studied this, that people go into it with positive attitudes end up surviving more because your body follows your mind. When it comes to things like stress, when you're mentally stressed to a high degree, I mean, your body follows your mind because your mind is in your body, and you release a shit ton of glucocorticoids, which are, I mean, cortisol. Cortisol is the downstream product of that, and people talk about the stress hormone and how much damage that does, and then you end up with this basically a neurotransmitter feedback loop where you keep creating this thing that breaks down your body. Cortisol is a catabolic hormone, which is great when you need a release of some energy from your fat supply or something, which is like cortisol is not always bad. We talk about nothing's always bad. Cortisol, you have a spike in cortisol in the morning because you're getting up, and we evolved to have to work for our food. So you would have to get up and do something stressful to eat. That's where the disconnect is, because now we get up and pour some Kellogg's, right? So it's cortisol is a good thing. You spike in the morning because your body's getting prepared to do things. So you need blood sugar, you need release of fat stores, you need all of these things, and that's what cortisol does. But if it's constantly there, it's catabolic, which means it breaks you down. It's basically people who are constantly stressed, their insides, if you were to kind of uh, make a visual out of it, looks like the surface of the moon. It is covered with just, and that's all of your systems. That's your brain, that's your liver, the inner lining of your blood vessels. That's where a lot of heart attacks come from, is that irritation of the blood vessels, which causes plaque to build up, which is the source of your heart attack. It gives you the sticky surface because it's pocked basically from all these stress hormones. So if you are mentally, like he, in his case, he's basically, this is where my interest area of research is really interested in. He's became super hyper type A. He is the steel sword. He is the guy that is going to get the job done no matter what. And he's destroyed his body with it, which in this metaphysical case is also destroying the land. And when he released that, this is the thing about type A's, is they can't let go of anything. You have to let go. You have to let go and be in the moment.
And also, again, why I love that scene when he finally goes to Tam. Well, twice is first here in the next book when he goes back and he breaks down and starts crying. So that's the start of letting go. That is at least letting part of the burden go. But you don't just flip a switch. Life doesn't work that way. People don't work that way. It still takes some effort and some help from his father to really let it go. And if he hadn't had that sparring match before he went on to Shao to face the Dark One, he wouldn't have been able to do what he did.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah,
because
look at his perfect world. That was that I used the word in there on purpose. Perfect. He wanted it to be a certain way with no evil. That's very rigid. In fact, so rigid it's evil in and of itself.
The next bit there where we stopped in that modern wisdom bit is they talk about a specific technique which is like pickup artistry 101. One of the very first things you're told to do as an exercise is to go out and ask, not get, but just ask 50 girls for their phone number. And Peterson's nodding along because, again, he's a clinician. And as he says, yeah, exposure therapy. So this is one of the, and it's later we'll get into why the shadow is so tempting. but this is why. This is one of those
yeah,
reasons.
I remember where you wanted to go with this. So it's not only tempting, but inevitable at some point. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is, and so we won't play the whole thing, but I highly recommend you go listen to it. And this is where he gets into the Tate brothers and that movement is there's a kernel of truth there because exposure therapy is, or at least can be, depending on the individual, a good thing. It's as they in their back and forth as they put out, a couple of things off the top of their head of why this and how this could be beneficial is one, get you out of your shell, you know, forces you to do something that's uncomfortable. And as we have talked about ad nauseum, you got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable if you want to live a good life, psychologically and physically. And also, I don't remember which one of them makes the point of also rejection isn't the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So you might only get one or two numbers out of 50, but hey, you got a couple.
Which is sales training too. The law of large numbers. You make
Exactly.
enough phone calls, you will make so many sales.
That's why I brought that up when he started talking about running a script. Is there's a reason you do that. But then so one of the other benefits of that is okay, don't don't get into that negative feedback loop. You don't have time. Don't give yourself time to get into a negative feedback loop because that was only 47. I've got to get to 46 here. I'm working my way down to the last one. All right, cool. I'm done. It's not rejection isn't failure isn't the end of the world. As Luce Theron says, we got to do over. We can do it right this time. You can polish up your script. You can make it better. The so one of the reasons the shadow is so tempting is because there is a kernel of truth there. That's why we paused in the middle last time of Peterson talking about Nietche, because the first part of that first slide, that first quote from Beyond Good and Evil, the first part of that paragraph there is it's inevitable, give up. But then in the next part of the quote, the very next slide is but and there's the problem where the temptation of the shadow is, and why it's hard to break is because the shadow isn't going to let you get to the but. It doesn't want you to. And I think a part of you doesn't want to either, because then that's more work.
Mm-hmm.
Rand had the courage of, as going back to the first clip with Friedman, the faith to say it is good. Yeah, there's a lot of bad, but there's enough good that it's worth fighting for. It's
Mm-hmm.
worth continuing to, as the Shinaran borrowed from Japanese samurai saying goes, death is lighter than feather, duty is heavier than a mountain, but the mountain is worth carrying. And the temptation of the shadow is no, don't even look over there. Don't even look over there.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a deal of courage and faith that is required to even look at the other side and say, well, what does this side have to offer? Is this worth it?
Yeah. Trying to formulate this thought as we just talked about a few minutes ago. We do that with all kinds of things because everything we do, I was going to talk about marriage, but let me just talk about buying a car, right? So if you're buying a car, we can get in two loops. One is, what am I giving up by making this purchase? Not the money. I'm talking about versus other purchases. So I want a truck, or I could have the Corvette, or I could have the mid-sized SUV that's great for the family. I have all these options. We have options with cars, right? And sometimes there's cars I can't stand, and I always look at it and be like, what made you choose that car? But we all also have different priorities, right?
Yep.
So you can approach buying a car in two different ways. You can say, what do I want in a car? Or what am I giving up with this car? And we do, yeah, that's if you approached everyone with what am I giving up in this car, you probably wouldn't make your purchase because there's always something. The pickup truck, well, I don't have the big covered back that I could put all my groceries in while it's raining. The mid-size SUV, I can't pull a stump out of the ground if I needed to. The sports car, man, I'm fast, but I can't store anything in this thing. So, and it's cramped and it's uncomfortable. Sports cars are actually very uncomfortable. So yeah, if you focus on the things you're giving up, you probably never will make a purchase. But if you focus on the things that you want, you could probably say, well, I want this more than that. And you can finally come to a decision.
That is a good for me. That leads me to my final thought and wrap up and tease of next time because um what is it that pulls Rand back from the brink? Well, what drives him there are this constant existential crisis that he has had to face and has let himself get mired in the depths of, in the abyss, the Nietzschean phrase. Well, what pulls him out of it isn't a counter existential, it's the tangible.
Mm-hmm.
It is the relationships, going back to the pyramid. It is what he has legitimately accomplished and the relationships he has solidified along the way that make it worthwhile. Is if you only one of the, we're going to talk Wednesday basically about dopamine chasing and why it has created so many broken people and a kind of broken culture. And one of my thoughts on that is Sapolsky and why zebras don't have ulcers and why we're getting ulcers younger and younger is because everything is existential. When the zebra is getting chased by the lion, that is absolutely an existential crisis. That is literal life or death. But then it's done, and I shake it off literally, and now I can go back to grazing because I'm hungry.
Mm-hmm.
So it is existential. Rand is facing some serious existential problems here, but also you got to eat, bro.
Yeah, which is actually, I think this is a direction I would love to take that conversation and this connects to Rand directly because I've said over and over and over again that the source of his strength is the fact that he's had so much trauma here. Is maybe the direction of therapy with people who have had traumatic childhoods is to take it in a direction of how are you stronger from this
Mm.
versus, oh, that's so sad. Let's dwell on it. And yeah, because realistically, just like the zebra, the best of the best people most probably had traumatic childhood of some sort because they're strong. And you add other characteristics to it, they're strong and smart and, good with money or whatever, plug in XYZ there. Nietzsche is a great example. He was basically dying his entire life because
Mm-hmm.
he probably contracted syphilis as a kid, which, that's hygiene wasn't great back then, and so his health problems actually probably gave him strength to do other things in his life and add a genius to that. And what's his name? Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn. His struggle was why he had so much to offer this world.
Mm-hmm.
So that, yeah, it's the opposite of the dopamine kick. It's the positive aspects of it because your dopaminergic system is geared towards survival versus geared towards pleasure. And that might be a good direction for that conversation. Where Rand, his trauma is part of his epiphany at the end because he was letting it guide him when he should have been using it as a tool to create strength.
Yeah. Well, we will get into that deeper on Wednesday. And then next Wheel of Time, I think we're going to talk about Lanfear
Oh
because
yeah, we have to hit Lanfear.
she's very interesting, very important, and
Oh, we had comments from last time, by the
one
way.
of the few worthwhile things about the series. Speaking of the series, isomorphics idea of when we spent a lot of time on RJ's response to a fan letter, and the theory from our Russian fan base is the letter was probably written by one of the show producers. Now she finally has her revenge. Oh God, yeah, probably. Um, Speaking of show producers, I asked about the idea that Lanfear had faked her death. Uh, Sanderson flat out says it was his intention for Lanfear to stay alive after faking her death. He said this during one of the long podcasts with some soy jack dude who fawns over the Watt TV series. Oh gosh.
Yeah, and I looked at the schedule. March 13th
13th. Yeah.
is the premiere, and it's going to be the first 3 episodes.
Oh.
First 3 episodes, then it's an episode a week after that. Uh, so we'll at least have some now. This in the same article where they had that they had Rafe interviewed, and he was like, "This is the most book accurate adaptation of all the series," and I'm like, "Why didn't you start that way? Why did you have to have people complain for you to do that?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, don't be proud of this. Don't be proud of this. You forced it because people hated you. And
And
guess what? We're still going to hate you.
as we pointed out, with a number of issues, both large and small, with the first 2 seasons, how are you going to be book accurate when you had so many glaring book inaccuracies in the first 2 seasons?
Yeah, yeah.
I forget how many times we talked about knock-on effects.
Yeah, are you going to ignore them and pretend nobody noticed, or are you going to? Uh, we remember the old fables. They were there for a reason because they teach you lessons.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. She swallowed the spider. Just yeah. Where are we in that sequence? Are we at the cow yet? Are we at the what's the one that kills her? I think it was the cow that kills her, right?
Can't remember. Yeah.
But if she keeps swallowing bigger things to get the thing that she swallowed before, that's a metaphor to lying. You tell a little lie, and then you tell a bigger lie, and then you tell a bigger lie to cover the littler lie.
Mm-hmm.
And how many of those stupid decisions, we'll just call it, in the first 2 seasons, are they going to have to swallow a cow for? I didn't want to end on a negative note because we were supposed to end with positive Rand. Rand became good again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Rand became good again and actually did good things because of it.
And I
There's
think the
something.
main point of all that meandering is because he focused on the things that were good in the world. He
Yes.
saw it and it was good. It wasn't perfect, but it was good. And it's definitely better than not being there. And it's definitely better than being full of Trollocs, right?
Yes, that's a good way to put it. And building off of what we talked about Wednesday is not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Even if it had been messy, he had done a lot of good things up until this point. For crying out freaking loud, he cleansed the taint. And he lets that actually, speaking of life lessons, is he lets his greatest accomplishment drag him down because he's so annoyed that people don't take the news better. Dude, take the win. Stop turning the win into an L. It's a win. You did it, man. You did
Yeah, but
something mega.
you gotta understand the annoyance though.
Sure,
Because I mean
you
it's
can
like
understand it, but you can also criticize it letting you drag you down,
well, let me
which is the
go.
difference in
I
later
promised
him.
I wasn't gonna earlier. I wasn't gonna make a marriage analogy, but I am going to suburban life marriage. The guy's going out and making the money, taking care of everything, works long hours, comes home. We did a DAX song about this breakdown, and has divorce papers on the table because you just don't pay enough attention to me. That's what Rand was feeling.
Yeah.
That's what this is. And I told you the demographic for suicide rates is usually that guy.
Yeah.
And especially if he loses his job in the process. And a lot of times when that middle-aged dude loses their job, the wife leaves him with the kids. Not leaves with the kids, not leaves him with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
Leaves him taking the kids. And you've lost everything as Rand is, and nobody appreciates what you were doing up until that point. And that's Rand just did the biggest thing in the world, and nobody appreciated it. That drives you crazy.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need no taint for that to drive you crazy.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But to Peterson's point, are you going to let it? Well, for a long time he did let it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he realized, oh, well, I really can't just lay down in a ditch and die, but more importantly, I don't want to.
Which is why books like these are so good,
Mm.
because they are basically, these fantasy tales are a giant version of what we feel every day,
Mm.
of what we normal people feel.
Yeah. The good ones are the ones that last.
Oh
That's
yeah,
why they last.
I was about to, I didn't think I had to qualify it like that because you don't even remember the ones that didn't, but
Yep.
yeah.
All right. Well, we will get into more of that next time, and we will see you then.
Yep, off to do taxes now.
Ugh.